In about 1964, when I was beginning the fourth grade, a guy appeared on the playground one day, one of the students in the grades ahead of us, and he had a word we'd never heard before. The word was soccer. It was a game, apparently, where you kicked the ball around and scored points. And that's everything we knew about soccer. We had an old tether ball. You remember those? That's what we used as the soccer ball. About every 10th kick, you got the metal hook on the side of the ball. And everything else that we knew, everything else about the game, we invented, because that was the only thing we knew. We never saw the game, never heard anything except the word, and that you score points by kicking the ball from one end of the field to the other. It was peculiar to our place. But we were able to do that because of one refrain, one that made sense to every kid who played the game, and that was, it's not fair. If you run into something that's not fair, you have to make a rule. And when you make a rule, it addresses what needs to be taken care of. That's how after, a couple of weeks, we had a long list of rules about what to do, how to play. Now, that's a pretty minor point in the life of the world. We made up a game that we called soccer. Nobody else would know what it was. But that energy in us is actually an expression of the very first page of the Scriptures, where it describes in the creation God that placed everything in perfect balance and harmony. Every aspect of creation meshed together to form a world that was in equipoise, perfectly balanced, and everything worked just right. And when the man and the woman were created and placed inside of this creation, they were a product of that perfect balance, so that they could identify from the beginning when something might be out of balance. Now, this is a capacity that lives in us even after the fall. Even though the awareness and the conscience and the intellect of the man and the woman were darkened by the encounter with sin, their creation took place inside of a world where what was expected was that everything meshed together in perfection, so that everyone in the world, in every circumstance, no matter what their background is, understands when someone says, it's not fair, it doesn't match up. Now, maybe not about international relations or even the relationship between who's ahead and who's behind. But all it takes is two people in the same circumstance for each one to understand this situation, those words, that measure isn't fair. Because all of us understand there needs to be some sense of how the world meshes together. It's a product of how we were created. It is woven into our lives in every way. And so when John the Baptist appears out of the desert and stands on the shore of the Jordan and begins to announce the coming of the Messiah, the people are animated because they understand that there's something new about to happen. And when they hear, their ears are cocked to what he has to say, and their hearts become enlivened. It enlivens the most basic and certain parts of their lives. They know that in a world where things are fallen down and they live in its ruins, in a world that's marked by uncertainty and unfairness, in a world where murder and power and oppression are what everyone knows, that if something new is going to happen, they lean toward it. And so they come to John and they ask and receive the answer that is the dearest to their hearts. They ask, "What must we do?" And John gives them two answers, and the first enlivens them in every way. And the first answer is the one that they most expected, which is, if you want to open the door for God's beginning to act in a new way, if you want to see where God is going to act next in a way that's going to be extraordinary, if you want to see what God did for your ancestors to bring them out of slavery and into freedom, to leave behind those who would oppress so that they could enter a place of promise and goodness, a land flowing with milk and honey. If you want to see what happened with them, lean toward what is measured and fair. For those who have too much, or at least have more than enough, give to those who do not have. For those who are satisfied, provide for those who are hungry. Stay inside the boundaries of living your life and making your work count. And if you happen to be the ones with arms, don't use the sword point or the sharpness of the blade to impose your will. Make the world measured. Return to what you know is fair and good. That is, after all, what God created. It is, after all, what God intended. If you want to prepare for what God will do, take your life back to where your life started, in what is fair and just and good. That's a message all of us want to hear. It's a message that enlivens everyone because it goes to the very heart. John said, if you want to be ready, if the Messiah is ready to come, this is how to receive him. Prepare. Be ready. Be just. Fulfill. Care. Give. Equate. That's John's message. It's one we've received. It is one that has animated the 20th and the first quarter of the 21st century. In nations everywhere, people have risen up in order to provide for those who have the least. The most powerful political dynamic in the last 125 years is to provide for those who have not. And the most powerful political movements have been founded on the basic understanding that it isn't fair and that life ought to organize itself better in a way that those who do not have can be provided for by those who do. John's message has been received even by those who don't care a moment to imagine there might be an initiative from God himself, where they care not for God at all. But they've heard and they understand. John's message reaches across the pages of the scriptures. It reaches across political divide. It even reaches across those the divide that separates those who believe and who don't believe. Be just, be fair, be equitable. Of course, in all of this, we've forgotten it's the first thing that John said and not the last. In fact, we have forgotten that it is only a preparation in order to receive the Messiah that John delivers his message to those who come to him. He didn't forget, but we have forgotten. If we take a look at what's happened in the 20th and the 21st century, our preoccupation with these political movements have produced 500 million murders between the beginning of the 20th century into the first quarter of the 21st century. There's been nothing more destructive in the history of the world in terms of total human suffering than the pursuit of equality, equity, and equalness. Because once you get started, you can never stop. There's no way to get to appropriating and then distributing wealth and talent and opportunity. It ought not to be that way. There were lots of opportunities for it to turn out different, but it didn't. 500 million murders in the last 125 years because we forgot. That's not the message. It's the first part of the message. Because John said, if you want to be prepared for what God shall do, if you want to return to this beginning moment, this is the way to prepare. But remember, there is something else besides. And then John begins to describe the power of the Spirit that will come to burn away the categories by which we define ourselves. The power of the Spirit that will occupy the world in a way that none of us will be able to recognize how we measure, whether we're behind or ahead. None of us will be able to stay simply in place according to the categories that measure and mark us. John said, oh, you have no idea. Because when the Messiah comes, when all is in place, everything that you expect will be smeared out. And whether you're behind or ahead, whether you're on the bottom or on the top, whether you've gotten there on time or come up late, all of the categories that you describe will be taken away. And what you have is a world that you don't recognize. Now, that's good news if you're on the out. It's terrific news if you're a slave. It's the best news of all if what your life is marked by sin and failure and rejection. To know that everything begins again in the goodness of God who has started over. It's the best news of all. Now, what if it were the case? Again, in a political and sociological environment marked by this last 125 years, that we listened to John's message. And we looked into the mirror of our lives and saw what lay in prospect there, which is this: that what we imagine of ourselves, who we are, and the yardstick that we've always used for our lives, that cry that comes from our hearts about what's fair and what's not, and whether we're taking part in the right way or not, that in the promise of the coming of the Messiah, that the yardstick has simply been thrown out the window. What if the promise of the Messiah were the promise of heaven, which is among the redeemed, all of the categories are burned away, and all the saints seem to be alike? What if it were the case that as we approach one another, all the things that we hold about one another were simply taken away, and we addressed one another as people who were new? What if we looked into the mirror of our lives and were able to see the image that stared back as someone not marked by failure or sin or ignorance or success and goodness and hope, but instead was someone, this image that stares back at us, made new completely? That, John says, is the hope we have when God begins to act. Just imagine God at work among us, the way he was at work, even among Pharaoh, in this invitation to set his people free. That God delivered to Israel this great leader, Moses, whom he had called when he was 80 years old to come back out of exile to lead his people from slavery into freedom. He gives Moses the message and he says, "You tell Pharaoh to let my people go." And Moses dutifully went to Pharaoh and delivered the message, and Pharaoh said no. Moses, who was as aware of fairness and unfairness, of equitableness and oppression as any man, reported to God what Pharaoh had said. And God, rather than striking Pharaoh down, rather than sending a band of angels in order to push the arms of the slave drivers away, God, rather than simply transporting his people across the Red Sea, God turns to Moses and says, "Pharaoh will do my work." Pharaoh's no is only the prelude for the world to see my glory. So Pharaoh can say no all he wants. It simply makes what will happen glorious. Remember, when Moses approached the burning bush and God gives him the message, "Go set my people free." And Moses says, "What am I to tell the people when I get there? Who is it that sent me?" And God says, this puzzle, "You tell them, I am who am," or I am whom I will become. This is what God said to Moses. "You want to know who I am? You come back here in a year and you'll know. In a year, my people will pass from slavery into freedom. In a year, my people will have a law that justly distributes the goods of their lives. In a year, my people will have an identity, a name, and a destination. You want to know who I am? You come back. That's who I am." And John says, you want to get ready for God to act, for the coming of the Messiah. You wait and see. What shames you now is the open gateway to the power of God at work in your life. What is tinged with darkness because of the decisions you've made badly becomes the contrast for the light that will fill your lives. What is the failure of your own moral scale becomes the resource for proclaiming the work of God in the world. You can't imagine, John says, because when the Messiah arrives, all will be new. It's the Lord's invitation today. It's the promise of our lives today. It's the certainty of our goodness today. It's the work of God in the world today. Because the Messiah is to come among us. And our word is to be ready today.